Have you ever wondered where the experience of being a person comes from? There's no real reason why just having a brain or having a body means that we as human beings get to have an individual experience that we call our subjective reality. And of course, our identity is at the core of this. And in many spiritual traditions, the question, who am I, is often at the center of especially Eastern teachings. But in all traditions, knowledge of self is seen as somehow paramount for the individual on their quest. Now, what the self is a very important place to start, and why learn about the self in the first place is a good place to start for that question. And of course, defining your terms is very important, and at the same time, there has to be some sort of intuitive understanding, because with all of this, we're talking about abstract things in the sense, or things that are not things, and things that go beyond thingness, so to speak, of being in the material world. And that's really what this actually gets to the core of, is energy and matter. You know, Einstein's equation, we understand that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, that whatever we perceive as matter is actually energy. And perhaps there's another layer deeper of consciousness, something like that, where there is a correlation in the same way between energy and matter as there is with consciousness and energy. Perhaps that's a distinction for another time, and it's enough to just say we're living in a sea of energy, that things that appear to be things are not necessarily as they seem to be, that we can be more attuned to this through the understanding of vibrations and frequencies and fields generally. The electromagnetic field is a very simple place to start, because we understand now with our awareness of technology that we have a great impact on the electromagnetic environment around us through the technologies that we choose to use. And our own electromagnetic field, of course, is also therefore impacted, or at least connected to the electromagnetic influence of the technologies. At the same time, our electromagnetic field, our bioelectric field that we generate, even in as simple terms as there's what's now called an MEG, or a magnetoencephalogram, which allows someone to place a magnet, essentially similar to a fMRI, on the outer surface of someone's head without touching it, and they're able to measure thoughts in different regions of the brain without any electrodes or anything connecting physically to the brain. So thoughts or brain activity is measurable without contact to the brain, if that makes sense. And I just bring that up in simple terms because science is at the forefront of understanding how we inhabit these bodies, or even brains or minds, as something perhaps that is beyond the brain or mind. And getting back to the concept of self and of identity, the ancient Greeks came around to the term know thyself in the same way that the Indians came to the term what we call self-realization, the Atman, the awareness of the infinite, or the cosmic man, essentially, or the cosmic individual, as somehow the goal of being a human being. That to say the goal of yoga is union with the divine or union with the infinite is our goal, is then to see that we are somehow deeply connected to the entirety of this universe and of this space that we inhabit, that we call our bodies and our minds. And there is deep wisdom and knowledge that's embedded in this system, the wetware, so to speak, of our nervous system and our physical DNA, and the awareness that we have been through a programming for millions of years to get us to this point. Every single one of our ancestors has had to survive through something, and that information has been passed on for eons, and that process goes far beyond just what we think of as our human ancestors, but even before our ancestors were humans, that this process has been going on for as long as time memorial. So this connection that we have to the self and to identity, in one way you could say, sure, that it emerges as a nascent property of a certain level of complexity in the brain, reaching a point where eventually we have this subjective understanding of the self, that 1.5 billion years ago, when our ancestors were essentially sea sponges, there wasn't that same level of consciousness and understanding that we have now reached through the complexity of our nervous system. There's definitely a strong statement of truth to that. And at the same time, to say that that is the whole story, perhaps is negating some other deeper question that still is, how did we get here? And how did we get here as human beings, as individuals at this point in history, and history of the planet in terms of not just the last 10,000 years, but of all biological life on Earth. And we can see in context that, one, we're a very small and short blip, but perhaps also that this has been going on a lot longer than we're aware, in the sense of this all coming to a head in terms of us being some unique species that, however we got to this place in our evolution, we now have the experience of awareness of self. And that, to our knowledge, there's not much evidence of that in any other creature on Earth. And there may be the potential for other animals to gain awareness of self, which is a really fascinating topic for another time. But there is this overall understanding that we have the experience of being a self, and we have a lot of data from neuroscience saying that this area of the brain does this, this area of the brain does this, but there's no coming together of the pieces of the brain and then that somehow forming the subjective experience of you tasting chocolate, going, wow, this chocolate's amazing. And that's perhaps the next step for science in general, and human understanding perhaps, is to reintegrate that holistic perspective with the understanding that there is a place for mechanistic science, and that there is a place for that reductionist, Cartesian, that whole realm. And at the same time, there's something even as simple as where we're going with quantum physics, where we have this entirely new realm of science, if you will, that contradicts the majority of what has been discovered over the last 500 years or so. And now we're at the point of saying, what is the role of what we cannot measure physically? And the simplest terms is that there's a lot of qualia subjective experience or even observation, and observation being the key vehicle for science itself, that our subjective experience and our observation are not things, in the sense of you can't touch the feeling of an experience. And this is true for all of us. And what that gets to is what lives beyond the physical experience. And where does it live, so to speak? Where do our thoughts come from? Do our thoughts come from our brains? Are our brains receivers for thoughts, like essentially acting as antennas rather than strictly generators? Or are we somehow existing beyond this physical body, in a sense where we are aware that the body and the mind are here doing their job, so to speak, and we are simply dreaming this dream into existence, and our self or spirit exists beyond the mind and body, somewhere beyond space and time. And that is something that has been postulated both in the modern consciousness and neuroscience and quantum physics communities, as much as it has been in ancient philosophy and wisdom traditions and religions for thousands of years. And the understanding that this is something that we have tools to measure in some way, but the tools and the technologies that we've been given are within us. That there's a lot to be said for the idea of the blind person who has been told or understands everything about color from a scientific perspective, and then by some miracle that person actually regains sight and then now is able to see color. There's a much greater difference in that person's qualitative scientific understanding, if you will, but just much deeper understanding of what color is once having actually experienced it from gaining sight. So the fundamental problem that science is bumping up against is that there is no physical tool for measuring consciousness, that consciousness can only measure consciousness, and that this is the limit of science in many ways, or at least of material science, and that our level of tool building perhaps will get more advanced in terms of our ability to detect consciousness. And at the same time, there's a certain evolution to the human mind that can serve as a more valuable tool than the development of external technologies. And what this means is that in order to understand the implications of science, we understand that there is an impact of the consciousness of the scientific researcher themselves. Of course, this is very, perhaps more obvious with Einstein than perhaps anybody else, because the level of consciousness of Albert Einstein was different than a lot of other scientists. There's a certain playfulness, imagination, creativity, innovation, and willingness to go outside the box with Einstein that is rare to find. And this gets into the idea of dogma and orthodoxy in both religion and in science, and how the convergence of these two are just sort of happening of their own accord through this concept of consciousness and quantum physics, and understanding our connection to what is beyond this reality, or our connection to the cosmos, that we have to come to terms with this dance, that there are paradoxes embedded in the mystery of life, and to allow for paradox is perhaps one of the most fascinating pieces that we get to, either in religion or in science. With religion or philosophy, it's non-duality. It's this concept of there is both light and dark, and yet somehow they are part of a greater whole. And there is somehow a piece of darkness in the light, or light in the darkness, that there is the non-dual experience of there only being one essence, and that our understanding of that one essence is then translated into our concepts of God and morality, and our understanding of how we treat others with kindness, how we follow even in the principles of Christ of forgiveness, and understanding where our thoughts generate our actions, and the process of understanding karma, or cause and effect, and allowing ourselves to become free from that. It's an ongoing process for humanity, and at the same time, when taken up by the individual or a group of individuals, becomes a magnet for that. So there's this process of understanding that what's happening then in a similar way in science is understanding with quantum physics the wave and the particle, that is matter, with an electron, with an electron microscope, there is the observation of electrons both as waves and particles. And therefore, we find that life is a paradox. It's both the wave and the particle. So enjoy riding the wave on your particle board, and surf the seas of life with grace. Blessings.